Thank you, everyone. I'm with the Writers Guild of America East, and I run our indie film caucus, and we're about to expand to have a documentary film caucus, but our goal is to create a culture and a community for indie filmmakers in New York City. We just had an indie film summit in October, and I think in March we'll be doing something focused on documentary filmmakers, but if you have any questions about the Writers Guild, please find me after. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. We've got a few of amazing documentarians, and so I want to just go down the line and introduce everyone. Or does everyone want to introduce themselves? Okay. Well, I don't know if David.
Do that?
Yeah.
My name is David Riker. I'm delighted to be here. Most of my work is in fiction filmmaking, but I also work in documentary, and the thing that excites me the most is the gray zone between them, the way in which they have lots of common ground. So.
My name is Yance Ford. I'm a documentary filmmaker. My film's title is Strong Island, and I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for the conversation.
My name is Cecilia Aldarondo, and I'm also a documentary director. And my most recent film is called Memories of a Penitent Heart. It's a first-person documentary about my uncle's death from AIDS in 1987.
I'm Sarah Burns, and I'm also a director and writer, and made the Central Park 5 and a film about Jackie Robinson that was out last year.
Great. So I want to start off with the story. We spoke, Cecilia and I spoke a little bit beforehand about developing the treatment, but I'd like to know, for each of your films, where did the story start when you decided to make the film, and then in the middle of filmmaking, where did the story really start for you?
Can we start on the other
side?
side?
Sure, yeah.
That's me on the spot instead. I guess I'll start talking about the Central Park 5, which for me was my sort of introduction into documentary filmmaking. I had written a book about this story before, and so that was my entry into filmmaking, and it had everything to do with a passion about that story. But I think for me, so having approached it through these two different mediums was really interesting, because the ability, I think it worked that I did it in that order, and that I had created relationships with the subjects of the film first through working on the book, but the film ultimately provided this platform for them to, in their own voices, in their own words, express themselves. And to me, that was the most extraordinary thing about that process, and what felt so different from working on a book where I could interview them and I could quote them, but it just was not the same as being able to show them and give them this space to tell their own story. And so for me, that was really the way I kind of came to it, and that was really meaningful to me, to be able to have that space to give them that platform.
Yeah, I have like my origin story about Memories of a Penitent Heart, which is that my mom found this box of 8mm films in the garage in 2008, which is true, but it's also a story that it's a film about memory and how we craft stories after the fact, and that's the story I've crafted after the fact about the movie. But I came to filmmaking as well, kind of from a different field. I was doing my PhD at the time, and I was writing a dissertation that was all about memory and objects, and how the discovery of archival material can catalyze our memories. And so I too had a kind of translation experience of learning this new audio-visual form, which I think if we're having a conversation about writing, it is both, I think, really important to the process, and also, one of the tools in the arsenal, I think, that filmmakers might use. And for me, this film was very much guided by, a process of investigation, discovery, excavation of my family history, and with that came a tremendous amount of surprise and serendipity, a lot of things that I didn't expect to be there. And so on the one hand, there was a lot of research and writing of treatments and sort of best laid plans, and then the world of documentary, or the world of the story, would sort of knock me off my feet and force me into telling a different story. And so for me, actually, that's one of the most exciting things about documentary, is when the world kind of forces you into shifting your sense of what the story is. So I think of writing as kind of like I don't know, it's almost like a mystical process in my mind.
For me, when I first started the film, it's ostensibly about the death of my brother. My brother was murdered 25 years ago by a white mechanic who claimed to have killed him in self-defense. And the very familiar narrative of, the scary black man, I was afraid for my life, so I didn't have, another choice except to shoot and kill him, even though William was unarmed. And, there was a situation where the person who shot him actually had not been involved, in the conversation or the confrontation he was having with the owner of this auto body shop. So I knew a lot about what had happened, sort of, and that's why, when you look at Strong Island on the surface, it seems like a true crime film, but it's actually not, because it's the procedural aspects of the story were very simple, right? And when I got to the realization that the film couldn't be about what, because what was the historical what, right? The answer to that question is known to us, and it's written as a part of our history in this country. My question turned to why and what happened after. And that's when the writing process that I had really started to be generative in a different type of way. I started keeping a production journal in January 2006, maybe, and I would write in that production journal just because I wasn't shooting at the time, right? And I needed a way to think about how I would make this film, what had to be on the table. I was having conversations with people who said everything has to be on the table. It always has to be on the table. And so this production journal for me became the place where I put everything on the table. And I kept writing in that journal over the course of the production. And so that was how I was developing the writing for both my interior voice as a director, and my characters in the film write their own lines in interviews. And I was really very deliberate about the types of questions that we asked, knowing that we would be culling their stories out of their responses to the questions. So, the writing process was always very aware that there were going to be answers, and then there was going to be ambiguity, that there was going to be clarity, and then there was going to be this kind of obtuse contradiction that the audience would ultimately have to wrestle with. So that's the point of all of the writing, was always to kind of be that North Star with all of those things in mind.
I want to. You actually answered the question I had when I was watching it, because I don't think I've seen someone address something so personal and be able to offer it to an audience. And I noticed that when it was most panging, you kind of read from a script in the film, but I wanted to ask you if you were aware that you had to balance how far you would go into your own heart and what you needed to deliver for the film's audience, because it had a beautiful balance, but I could feel what you were feeling, but also I felt like you were still serving the viewer.
Everything in Strong Island is in the service of the viewer. The scene that you're talking about, where I read for a bit of text about when I first found out that my brother had been murdered, I read from that text, which is from the production journal that I kept, because we were at the end of a 6-hour interview, and I couldn't get the story, I couldn't answer the question about how I found out succinctly enough, and I kept sort of going off, and I said, can I just fucking read it from my production journal? That's literally what I said, and they were like, you have this in your, and I said yes. So I printed out, like in that room, we edited it down, and in the film, it's used sort of, the beginning of it is from the journal, but then at a certain point, and this happens often throughout the film, with my character, because I'm the only person in the film who ever wrote anything. No one else, none of the other characters actually wrote anything. So we were able to get into the story, by reading from that piece of paper. But then the rest of the answer actually came after I came from my response to the question, right? So once I got over the hump of, Jesus, I can't remember, like I can't get this any more concise, then it was right into my answering the question. And I'm not quite sure how to answer the second part of your question. I mean, I wanted Strong Island to feel as visceral as the experience was, and so there wasn't ever. I mean, it was, and it was, the kinds of metaphors that I would use with the team would be like, I wanted to feel like your skin is being peeled back. I wanted to feel like it felt for my family. So, going to wherever place that that required of me as a director and as a subject of the film, it was just very simple. In order to communicate the historical nature of my brother's death, it had to be that everything was on the table. And, the fact that it's kind of blistering at times and heartbreaking at times and, rageful at times is all a part of it.
And David?
Let's see, Dirty Wars is the film that I was going to talk about, and the film is really belongs to two other people, to a journalist named Jeremy Scahill and a director named Rick Rowley, who spent about 2 years investigating the War on Terror. Jeremy, as a journalist for a book that he was writing. And they asked me to look at a cut that was very long and to me was unwatchable. I couldn't bear to watch it all because it was so horrific. And it was horrific not only because of the stories that they were reporting on, but the story was repeated over and over and over and over again. It felt like I described it as a catalog of horrors. And what I felt just as a human being watching it was that I could not watch it anymore, that any meaning had disappeared. So that's the background to my becoming involved in the project as a writer. And just not to talk at length, but the biggest, I think, challenge was recognizing that in order to tell a story so that people will lean forward and listen and stay with you, you have to get very honest. And in this case, that meant that the journalist had to express what it had meant to him to do the work, because journalists are never supposed to talk about that. They parachute in, they report on things, they leave, and the toll that it takes on them personally is never relevant to the story. But to me, it seemed like it was vital. And so the starting point was seeing if Jeremy would be willing, at least willing, to explore his story being part of the story.
Interesting. So I wanted to go a little bit more into the structure. I don't know if it's a good time to show a clip from Strong Island, because you kind of hinted about structure in talking about your journal. Is it okay if you could show a little clip of it, and then you could talk a little bit more about the structure? I love about documentaries that moment where the story's unrelenting, and I think that's when you're fully in the moment of the story. And I also wonder about your background, because I think that you've brought your eye to it in terms of the visual structure as well. But how did you start off putting this story together? And there's so many conversations that happen, and you flow from a family story to a social story to back to a personal story. What did you think about when you were setting up?
You mean during the shooting or in the edit?
I'm wondering, I guess, well, before you go to edit, so you're shooting, maybe going back to, you planning to go out and shoot.
Mhm.
But before you get to the editing, how are you thinking about what you're capturing and
Sure.
the characters you're involving?
Sure. So I'm thinking two things: that the characters in the film did not ever get to testify in court, and they didn't ever get taken seriously, particularly my mother, by the bodies that represent our judicial system. In terms of the way that we shot those interviews and the way in which I, sort of asked questions and then stood back and ultimately didn't interrupt my subjects, was to give them that, the idea was that they would have the chance to testify, right? That they would sit in front of the camera and look directly into the camera, and as a consequence, look directly at you, and have a chance to, sort of discuss the things that they were not able to discuss, that no one asked, that no one cared about 25 years ago. So that was the structure of those interviews. My interviews, I honestly didn't want to be in the film. It was, I had 10 rules at the beginning. The process about structure and about the form and the formality of the film being this thing and this platform upon which this really emotional story would be told, and that's why there's so much formalist a non-movement of the camera in the film, because it's such an emotional story that if it weren't formal, it would be untellable in a way. My character, sort of exists in this black void, partly because I didn't want to use myself on camera, and I was just thinking, like, I need to create a space if I'm going to answer questions and I don't know what's coming at me, where I'm as alone as I can possibly be. So there's if you can imagine, a wall of sound blankets. Everyone's on one side, I'm on the other, and that's how we get this sort of cocoon-like, place in which my character is divorced from time, and in which I, as the director, can actually step into the, my skin as Yance, the sibling of William Ford, and answer their questions like that. So that was, those structural elements were already in place. What you just saw in this clip was essentially a piece of writing that that took place in the edit that put my brother's death on in the historical context, right? So for me, the most important line in the beginning, before you see his face, is "Dredge the river, and you will find him, or someone who could have been him," which is a direct reference to all of the people in the American South, all of the black people who disappeared over generations and who were never heard from again, and who, like Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were often found at the bottoms of rivers and things in the South. And then right up against that, you have, after you see him in his humanity for the first time, you have the very clinical autopsy report. And the fact that the word unremarkable in the parlance of autopsies is used to describe something that's normal, right? So the heart is unremarkable actually means that structurally, not taking the gunshot wound into consideration, that his heart was normal, right? So that's just an example of how we, sort of, in the writing, took William, put him on a historical line, because that's how, that's the whole purpose of the film. The purpose of the film is not to, like, make a sad story about my family that, everyone will sort of, fall in love with my mother and feel bad about what happened and go home, right? William and people like William have been murdered without consequence since the founding of this country. So putting him on that historical line was important, but also hearing in the way in which the mechanism of the criminal justice system talks about the body, right? And it brings the corporeal experience into focus for the audience in a way that was really important for me in terms of using the autopsy report unaltered.
I want to ask the same question of you, Sarah. I happened to have seen Central Park 5 at the Maisel screening at the high school in Harlem, and retrospectively, it was like a prelude to society's conversation for the past few years about black men and the police. And I'm wondering, when you were setting up the story, were you aware of it being like a civil rights sparker? And so when you're putting together the story, what were you thinking about in terms of how the audience was experiencing it?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's interesting that that film came out in 2012 and 13, and it was I think the conversation was different at that moment. But think we were always thinking about this as how did this happen? And so that meant understanding the larger context, as you were just talking about, for this story, that of course it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And we actually, the going back to the sort of origin story, the Central Park 5 as a project actually began for me as my undergraduate thesis, which I wrote about the racism in the media representations of the Central Park 5. And that just, I sort of couldn't let go of that story. I had written kind of one chapter essentially of the book, though I really had to start from scratch after that, that was about the media coverage and the racist language that was applied to them: wilding, wolf pack, savage, and the historical precedent for that kind of language. And so that was always in the background of the and the foreground often of the project, which was the sense that this you cannot understand a story about this wrongful conviction without a much bigger conversation. And we were trying to make a human story about telling the story of these 5 teenagers. And we actually had that conversation early on. I had it first about the book, which is this a book about sort of these structural inequalities and problems with this as a case study, or is this a human story? I mean, is this their story with a context that helps you better understand it? And I chose for the book, and we chose for the film, the latter, which is the focus is on these 5 human beings, their families, their experiences, but you cannot tell that story without that context. And so it was certainly always there in every moment, wanting to understand, where does this come from? Why was it so easy for the police and the media and the public to create and then to believe this narrative about them? And that was everything in the story. And so they're so linked that you cannot separate them. But for us, it still had to be about the sort of human experience at the core of it.
And so I guess, David, I want to turn to you, because I guess the war on terror is a sort of thing that it's I guess it's a class divide. I feel like if you're very intellectual, you have a sheer language on what's happening in the world, and for a lot of people, it's a unknown ghost that surrounds and reappears and then goes away. When you're putting together a story and you're essentially educating people on something that we haven't really come to a sense of knowing, how do you start that film off?
Yeah, nobody wants to, myself included, wants to really go behind the curtain and see what this country's doing. And it's how to start that conversation off. I would say 2 things. One is that documentary has a unique force, and the reason that it has such impact is because of that. But it also is, unlike traditional fiction filmmaking, its whole DNA is a little bit different, because fiction film always begins with the written word, always begins with a script. All the questions and thematic ideas and structural issues are wrestled on paper before realizing it. And in documentary, it's often the reverse. It's often, I've been in many rough cut screenings where filmmakers have been filming for years, and they haven't yet figured out what the story is. They know what their interests are, they know what their commitments are, but the story is sometimes elusive. So in this case, what is the story of the war on terror? It's just, it's too large a question to simplify. But when I watched that footage the first night with Jeremy sitting there, the whole time I was watching the footage, I was looking at him, and I was seeing that, and I've known him a little. I knew him, but I saw that he was really. I hope it's okay to talk about it publicly, but that he was really deeply affected by the work. That it had taken a toll on him, and both he and Rick, to me, had started to resemble some of the characters that they were filming, these special ops who are at the edge of empire, and because they spent a lot of time with these characters, and to see that maybe the story of the War on Terror could be told through the lens of its impact on someone who's just trying to report on it was relevant. And so that began a process, but after the fact. They didn't begin with that as a starting point. And even describing the traditional steps of a treatment and a first draft, I did write a treatment when I joined the production, and in that treatment tried to lay out this story that would be like a detective story, that would be a traditional whodunit. There's a body in Gardez in Afghanistan, and the family says that American soldiers not only killed these people, but then with their knives dug the bullets out, and then claimed that it was an honor killing. So Jeremy became a detective, and the audience is trying to answer a riddle, a mystery. But that riddle and mystery brings you right back into the epicenter of American power, because that is where that's where the core of the story is set. Unfortunately, is right here. That wasn't your question at all, was
No,
it?
it works. I was trying to figure out if I should show the clip or not. I want to show you the opening, I guess, so you can see how David set the story up. So I guess I like the way it starts, because I feel like, for me, I feel self-conscious about the things I don't know, and you set it up where I felt like I was growing. I felt, it's like when you go to math class, you start where you start. So I felt like it was starting in, arithmetic and slowly growing towards algebra and calculus. Were you aware of bringing the person, your viewer in when you were structuring, or are you just focusing on the journalist first?
Really, the overwhelming question was how to talk about this in a way that people would listen. That's the overwhelming question, because also that people here would listen, because my experience is that the greatest level of ignorance exists in the center of empire. And I think this was the case historically, that there's less understanding and knowledge of what is happening in the planet right here, where we have more information available to us than when you leave the bubble of the West or the U.S. So how to speak to an American audience, let's say my relatives, who don't want to talk about this at all. They don't want to know that there's 1,000 U.S. military bases around the planet and what that means. So that was, as a writer, the challenge was to be truthful to the actual investigation, to respect the work that this journalist was doing, to ask that he seriously consider putting himself into the film, which he refused to do for the best part of a year, and then to be true to the classic forms of storytelling, which is that somebody wants something very badly and there are obstacles to getting it, the truth or the knowledge. That was the starting point.
Cecilia, I love the texture of Memories of the Penitent Heart, and I was at a luncheon for another film this week, and it gave a little bit of context of what I really appreciated about it. And someone remarked that we lost several generations of people in the 1980s to AIDS, and for the LGBTQ community, there's an oral history that is required so that people will know that they existed, which affects so much of identity. And I'm wondering, because it's funny how I have an uncle that we don't discuss. I understand that. So I'm wondering, when you're setting up that story, at what point are you thinking the greater lens, and at what point are you thinking about your lens personally?
Yeah, I think that from the very beginning, I thought of this project as simultaneously autobiographical, personal, intimate, familial, all of that. And sort of like Yancey was saying, also very global. And I felt like one of the objectives that I had was to translate this really sort of seemingly small story and extrapolate it into something that people could see themselves in. And also, um, from the very beginning, it was I didn't necessarily understand it this way, but I was operating through a very kind of intersectional lens, in the sense that, part of the aspect of the story is about the fact that my uncle is Puerto Rican, and I, grew up in a Puerto Rican family, and a lot of the kind of cultural dynamics that were at play in that. But it was not reducible to that. I think that very often people of color, filmmakers of color, get tokenized in this way that we are representing that and only that aspect of a story. That my uncle becomes this sort of the poster child for the Latino angle on the AIDS crisis, and that felt very reductive to me. And so so that was only one aspect, but a very important one at the same time. But it was also at the same time a story about religion, say the Catholic Church, and the role that that played in my family. It was also very much I saw it as a solidarity film. This is a film where, it's driven by me, who is a member of this family, and it felt very important for me to make a film that wasn't just about the AIDS crisis or a person who died of AIDS, but also about kind of the complicity of essentially all of us. That AIDS became a crisis in part because straight people didn't think it had anything to do with them, or was their issue. And so part of mining the sort of family history of what happened in my family was looking at saying, how do we all understand what our roles were? So in that sense, my mother, my uncle's sister, becomes sort of a stand-in for that question of witnessing and what role do people who have an opportunity to provide solidarity and advocacy, etc. What happens if we as a society abdicate that role? So those were a lot of the bigger questions. The other thing I would say is that, going back again in my mind to this origin story, I've forgotten how much it was about a rumor that started the whole thing. My grandmother told this story that my uncle repented of being gay on his deathbed. And when I got older, that rumor became very troubling to me, and was always at the epicenter of the story I was trying to. It became the catalyst for this investigation. Did he repent? And if so, why would anybody choose to do that? What would be the factors? And in a way, in the end, the investigation became kind of a red herring, or a placeholder for the process of the film, because ultimately the heart of the film and the heart of the story is my uncle. And in that sense, it's not a biopic in the sense that it's trying to excavate him for all of you to understand, but in fact it's trying to map the contours of his absence and his loss. It's not about bringing him back because he's gone. And so what I realized only through the course of telling this story and asking other people about this is that the only person who can really explain why or if he repented is him. And so ultimately one of the things that we figured out along the way was that this is a story about what it means to die, and what it means to die having to wrestle with, it's already a horrible thing enough to die of a disease at 31 that nobody understands, and to die stigmatized, but then also to be going through that with a lover on one side and a mother on the other fighting over you. So that became part of the quest, sort of central quest of the film, was inviting the viewer to try and contemplate, not just what my uncle went through, but what we all will do on our own deathbeds. So.
I guess we've started talking about what the editor means to the process. I kind of want to go a little bit further into that. How did you find the editors that you work with, and what do you generally look for in that partnership?
Me? I found my editor on Mandy.com, which is like OkCupid for filmmakers. Not a recommended method for finding a great editor, but I got extremely lucky. I was a first-time filmmaker, and I didn't know very many editors, and I posted an ad and got about 300 completely unremarkable and wrong responses. But I put in the ad that I was looking for somebody ideally with a visual arts background and or interest in queer politics, and I ended up with a queer identified visual arts trained editor who her name is Hannah Buck, and we met and had a conversation and started sort of dating, I guess, and seeing if we were gonna get along. She became a really absolutely central part of the process. I think it's different with every film and with every team, and the needs of the project can demand different things. But in the case of this project, which I was so close to, I knew I couldn't. I needed perspective. I couldn't cut this myself. We had a very close dialogical collaboration, a lot of talking, a lot of back and forth. We got a residency at the McDowell Colony where we went together for a month and experimented. And I think, Hannah, one of the things that I really credit her for was her generosity of spirit and her willingness to experiment, because every time I would, which was very often, sort of tear my hair out and say, I don't know what to do, she would just say, well, why don't we try it? She really sort of encouraged me to take risks, to play, to be elastic. We did a lot of weird experiments with archival material, a lot of stuff that failed, a lot of stuff that just didn't work. But it became I think the editing room became a space, it was a laboratory and of trial and error that I think if I had had an editor who was more strict about, process, etc., I don't think we would have been able to, figure it out as we went along. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I guess we want to look at the food for thought.
Can I set it up for a second? Yeah. So I'll show those two back to back. So speaking of the role of the editor, I have two clips. The first one is essentially an aborted opening that we did not use. I've never shown this to really anyone, so welcome to my failure. The reason I wanted to show this to you is because I think one of the things that I struggled with, particularly as somebody with a very kind of intellectual training, for a really long time, I really struggled with the kind of conventional biopic 3-act structure that we ended up really working with. I wanted to make a more experimental, more essayistic, more intellectual film, and it just wasn't working. And so this opening that we abandoned is an example, I think, of the kind of movie I was wanting to make. And then directly after, I'll show the actual opening to the film, which ended up being the story that where we used the story in a more focused way to bring out the themes of the film. So the first one, I guess, is the one marked Food for Thought, and then the second one is the opening to the film.
Yeah, it's two totally different films.
But I think there's a similar set of concerns, like this question of what has been forgotten, setting up this, project of excavation, and I think that what we realize, there's something really, at least in my experience, I think openings are the hardest thing, or they were certainly for this project. It was just awful trying to get the opening down. But part of it was there's this very fundamental, I'm talking about the act of writing, like there are things the audience needs, and it's very like instrumental. Like, what do you need to know from a narrative perspective, from a stylistic perspective? What are you in for? What's the experience going to be? And I really resisted literalizing things, and in a way, using the audio from an interview managed to ground, I think, the sort of intellectual concerns in a narrative in a way that I think helps the viewer to understand, that this is not just an essayistic meditation, but that this is going to be more of what the movie actually is.
I want to show the Central Park 5 opening and then start to integrate the audience into the conversation. Sarah had mentioned something similar earlier, so I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
set
I
it up.
think, well, actually, maybe let's show it and then I can explain.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing Cecilia talk about this. Like, what is kind of necessary to bring up front to bring someone in, and for us, we had this real challenge, and I think also kind of resisted those cards at the beginning, and got to this point where it's like there is information that people must have to get this. You know, we had we have 5 characters and or main characters, and one of them would only do an audio interview, and there was a sort of cut of the film where we had incorporated that, and it felt like we had someone who saw the film and said it feels like the Central Park 4, and that was a problem, and we had to find a way, and there were other things that we did too, but just that one thing of sort of highlighting the fact that this is going to be a little different for this one character was just something that we had to do, and I sort of didn't always want to have to put all this and make you kind of start the film by reading a bunch of very sort of concrete information, but it was something that was important. And then we follow it with this very different kind of moment, which is the real perpetrator's confession. But it's this very, I mean, again, that's only audio, and we've got this sort of eerie, day for night stuff that we shot in the park, and it's a little hard to understand him, and so we're bringing these words up to try to make sure that you're capturing something of what he's talking about, but we're not entirely explaining it, and you may not understand exactly what it is, but it was really important to us that from the very beginning we made clear that the Central Park 5 were not guilty, and that we were never going to sort of, for the sake of tension or suspense, wait to tell you that. And so it ends up being this strange thing where we start the film with the perpetrator and the victim whose intersection kind of sets our story in motion, but who are not actually the characters in our film. Our characters are the Central Park 5 who were not there, who were not in that moment, but it felt really important to set their story up by kind of establishing a few of these things right away. The stuff in the cards, and then the fact of here's the perpetrator. You're not going to get to know him right now, but you need to know that he exists. And that was always really important to us to begin there, even if he's not, I mean, he does not play a large role in the rest of the film.
So, are there any questions in the audience? Or I have some questions to keep going, but I'd love to start. If you could, everyone could just kind of project, say your name, your current project, and ask the question.
Before I made the film, I had a really cool day job. I was a series producer at POV. Before I got that really cool day job, I was a working artist. I'd studied photography. So I came to this film with a background in the arts, that I'd been engaged in a very serious art practice since undergraduate school.
Did you know you were going to bring that part of yourself into how you design the film? I love the way you switch in and out the photographs, and I'm just wondering how that happened.
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, yeah. That actually is not. That actually is not the opening. That's actually toward the end of the film.
She was
Thank
saying that she really loved the clip that we saw, and the question was sparked by the stylistic.
Right.
I don't know.
I mean, I think it's part of what's really funny about this entire experience for me, and then I think we should go back to the conversation, is that in the doc community we all sort of think we forget that we come to these communities with pasts, right? We have prior lives. I got a really great job in 2002, but I had a life before I started working at POV, and that life, included working on Louise Bourgeois pieces that are now at the Guggenheim and Bilbao, and so I was a working artist who had a very sort of set understanding of what my aesthetic was. It was always formal. It was always focused on the gaze. It was always rooted in something very clear. So what you see in the film is just what happens when someone who has had to wait because who's had to wait to make a film, when they finally get to make the film, this is what it looks like.
The question is about the writing process directed to Cecilia and Yance.
Yeah, and the question was about the opening and at what point did we choose to abandon it and take a different direction. I mean, when I was talking about the trial and error in the editing room, I really mean it in that we would try things and abandon them almost immediately if they weren't working. We did that in a few hours and then very swiftly, I think it was there for about 5 days, and then we said this isn't the right opening. There were like six of these, and they were all quite different from one another, depending on what we needed. But in terms of the writing process, I was very, very insistent for a long time that I didn't want voiceover in the film. I feel like very often first person films, the expectation is there's going to be voiceover, and it's very often very literal and very sort of self-oriented, and I felt like it was kind of cheating to use voiceover. And so, but we had to find a way to give me a character in the film and to characterize my presence and why I was doing this. And even though I remain off camera in the film, even precisely because it was like really important to have a sense of who am I? But I again, I would try writing things, and it was just too stilted, too forced, too written. And so when we were at this residency, Hannah one day basically just handed me an audio recorder and said, "Why don't you go to my cabin and just talk into it?" And that originated some of the first voiceover that ended up in the film, and created this sort of template for a process of much more spontaneous kind of meditative reflection. And so a lot of the voiceover in the film isn't really scripted, it's spoken. With the opening, it became different because it was, again, so mechanistic. We had to get certain things in. But we still wanted to keep that sense of serendipity and and sort of have it feel kind of live. So that was part of what we would just like, she'd say, "Go talk about this," and I'd do it, and then we'd throw it in the cut and see if it worked, and then we'd tweak it again and throw it in the cut and see if it worked. So it was a very sort of cyclical process.
And for me, with the characters, when I first started, I wasn't thinking about structure or whether or not they would be the spine of anything. Making this film was the first time I had actually spoken to every person in the film, including my own mother and sister, about our experience after my brother's murder. So I went into these interviews simply wanting to learn as much about what they had experienced as I possibly could, because I knew that I had a certain experience from one place of my brother's murder, but that other people had experienced it from different angles, and I simply wanted to hear from them what their experiences, what their memories were, in an attempt to, I think, ultimately piece together, some kind of picture of the final, months of my brother's life and what happened to my family afterward.
So this is going to be the last question. So
I think that your description of your response is a perfect example of why we did what we did. William simply, we fade up to his face from a black screen, and there was no other intention behind that other than the question, "Do you see my brother?" And the thing that's really interesting, though, about your response is goes directly to the question of reasonable fear and what you see based on who you are. There is no hood, there is no fear for some people who see my brother's face come out of that darkness. Right? There are different things in response to that image depending on who you are. So you saw one thing, and for every other person in this room, they've seen something else. And that's exactly why we did it. To ask the question, "Do you see my brother?" And your answer says, I think, a lot about why we are where we are as a country. No, or you project onto a black screen something that actually isn't there.
So I want to close out with a question to the panel, a quick one-liner response. What's a final thought in terms of what's a great way to listen to an editor, and what's a great way to start a story? Or you choose one. Choose one. Sorry. What have you learned most from an editor And what have you learned most from your writing process?
Well, I just have one sort of quick thing about an editor we worked with on our Jackie Robinson film, Louis Erskine, who's a really incredible editor. A lot of you know him. And there was another clip which we didn't get a chance to watch today, but where we have this moment about Jackie and Rachel's partnership and what it means, and we have Barack and Michelle Obama sort of commenting on partnership, not theirs necessarily, but it's all there. And what Louis did was take this scene and just open it up and add this moment with music and with this beautiful footage of couples, of families, of weddings that had nothing to do with our story. And it was this incredible moment that completely changed the scene, and it was not something that was in the script. It was just him sort of recognizing that this was this moment to kind of open up, and that these two couples across generations, Jackie and Rachel and Barack and Michelle, who can kind of represent this African American experience of these different ways and these partnerships and what that means sort of across time. And it just took this scene that was sort of small and lovely into something that made it much bigger. And it's one of my very favorite scenes in the film because of that. And that was not something that was in the script. That was Louis. And that I still think about him every single time I see that scene because of that. So I'm grateful to him for that, and that really changed our film.
I think that what I would say is I think that it may be that the reason why documentaries fail is because their directors didn't listen to their editor. I think that most documentaries are too long because directors don't listen to their editors. I think that what I would say is listen to your editor and respect that your editor has their own tremendous craft that is not yours. To me, that's a very precious aspect of documentary filmmaking. Unless you're this beautiful one-man band that's that can do it all. To me, that collaboration needs to have equal respect for the office that you occupy. So yeah, and I would say in terms of the writing process, I'm teaching a class called documentary storytelling right now, and the sort of fundamental thesis of the course is that writing happens both in the beginning in sort of the form of treatments and best laid plans, and this is what I intend for the film to be, and then it sort of leapfrogs into the edit, into this process of discovery. And again, I think if we can't respect that nonfiction filmmaking depends on this after the factness very often, then we end up making really formulaic films. And so that for me is also, again, when it comes to writing in this particular genre, I think being open to change is like maybe the most central aspect of it for me.
I would say that my two things: make sure that when you're writing, that fundraising is always so much a part of how we have to get to the first piece of footage anyway. Make sure that you're doing another type of writing, right? Like let there be the proposal writing, but then have someplace else where you're doing the creative stuff and where you're doing your brain dumps and when you're writing down the stuff that comes to you in the middle of the night, because otherwise you find yourself, which is something that happened to me, looking at something and being like, wait a minute, this is a proposal, this isn't my voice, which is why I'm really glad I had this years long thing that I could go back into and remind myself of what my voice sounded like. And second of all, I would say be open to surprise. My editor or someone recently said, no, Jonathan Oppenheim said that the editor's job is to surprise you. And the editor that I worked with surprised me by putting the answer to what is this film about or what happened or who's dead right at the beginning of the movie, so that already who's the things you think that you're going to sort of spend the next 107 minutes figuring out, you learn it in the first minute and a half or 2 minutes, and then that leaves you with the question, well, what the fuck comes next? And that for me was a really exciting place to be as a director.
I would just say that I wished I had been taught about story earlier on. sooner. And that I think it's changing now that documentary filmmakers are studying storytelling, because for a long time it seemed that the whole spirit was that you want to go out into the unknown without judgment, without any predetermined outcome. But the more that we think as writers from the outset, the more there will be to edit down the road. So really just to emphasize the importance of story in all the work we do as filmmakers from the very start. Be my last words.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, Sarah, Cecilia, Yance, David. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you to the Writers Guild of America.